Hello, everybody, and welcome to Fast Talk Tuesday. If you've ever asked yourself, does this actually need to be training or can this just be a document? Or maybe you're putting your employees through read and understand hell and you're wondering how you can make the shift away from that, then this is the Fast Talk for you. So, how this works is we spend 10 minutes talking about the topic and 10 minutes doing a live question and answer session at the end. So, in 20 minutes, we're going to cover a whole lot of ground. And if you're out there watching, please just go ahead and do the usual, chat me in who you are, where you're from, why you're here today. In the interim, I'm just going to go ahead and get started because 10 minutes goes really fast. So, the big question, do we need documentation or training? And so many times, what I found is that there is an overabundance of training that exists at the organization and not enough documentation. But there is the caveat that sometimes, as we move too fast, there tends to be a shift in that where you might be relying too much on documentation that exists already to do the job of training people. So, the simplest way to think about it is do they need to know how to do a task, I should say, make that more specific. Do they need to know how to complete some sort of task and they want to know how to complete that task and they currently don't know how and are also willing to do it? If all of those answers are yes and it is task based, then there's a good chance training may need to be involved, right? They need to learn something new or they need to add to their already existing skill set. Now, when you don't need to train, would look like opportunities where it's just something they need to reference or it's just something quick. So let me capture that really quick. Documentation captures knowledge and it makes it easy to reference later. That means if you are looking to make sure you don't lose information, especially from some of your high performers and things that are kind of company wide, or that you need to reference later, right? It's not just going to be this one-time event, then that is a good reason to document it and to share documentation. Training, on the other hand, offers opportunities for instruction, practice, feedback, and reflection when done well. And so there are definite opportunities for that. So what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes is just walk you through a few scenarios. And if you're out there watching, I'd love to see how you respond, but I'll walk you through sort of how I would consider those moments as well. So the first one, you get a policy update. Let's say it's regulatory in nature. All of a sudden, you need to change this one little thing in this process about how you've always done it. What would you do if you're watching live? Would you put together training or would you put together documentation? I'll leave you to answer, but I'm going to get ready on my answer as well. So in this case, I think you're going to see really quickly that the answer is it depends. In a lot of cases, it will be it depends. So the reason it depends in this situation is because the policy impacts a process that people have already learned. It can be very challenging to change a behavior. I know we don't always like the phrase unlearn in the learning and development space, but that process of shifting something you've already become really conditioned to do can be a very challenging process. So in those cases, yes, Celia is saying training. I would agree that you're going to need some form of training because you're going to need to give people feedback as they implement this new process. Now, if it's just a simple policy update, let's say we're going to be using a new antiviral protection program at our company and everybody needs to upload it, then a document outlining, how you do that is probably more than enough for most people. Now, the second layer of that is once you have that process, right, going back to the original example, once you have that process adjustment, you will need to document it and you will need to make sure that documentation is distributed so that people have it to reference later, because odds are doing it one time isn't going to be enough to make the shift, and that your managers are going to need to prioritize change management and point to that policy time and again when people are failing to perform correctly if that happens. So it's going to be a training issue, but it's also going to be a documentation issue. Now, what you're listening for is, again, does it affect tasks or is it really just a little more information? So the next scenario, it's a repeatable process. So we need to train all of our new hires on how to use our point of sale system. So that's a generic one, right? Every time they're going to do the same things. They're going to come to the cash register. They're going to swipe the board this way. The client will put in their information, then they'll turn the board this way. They're going to review and see if X, Y, and Z is there. And if there's this issue or this issue, this is how they troubleshoot it. It's a repeatable process. Do they need training? Do they need documentation? All right. So like the last example, my answer is this: it depends. In this case, because we're talking about new hires, yeah, they're going to need training. And again, it's a new skill that they're adding on. It's a new task they're learning how to do. So they do need training. However, after that first time training, they're going to need documentation. That's the reference, the resource, the checklist maybe that sits next to their cash register, and that lets them know how to do this process every time. And if somebody is repeating a process over and over again, you're going to want to document it anyway, right? That's the way you're going to train the next set of new hires. So if you don't have that process mapped out right now, and it is just, shadowing, or the most senior person, or, the shift manager training that person how to do this thing, then now is a good time to sit down and realize you are going to need that documentation, and that can be the base for your later training. So I think you're getting the gist. So complex decision trees, they're much the same as well. On one hand, you're going to need to train people to make these decisions. On the other hand, if you can document that decision tree, it's a great reference point. Or maybe they're in information overload mode because they're new to the role. And later, when they've got sort of that base of foundational content and orientation about your organization, they can then go start to look at those decision trees and see how the managers or the high performers, top performers are making decisions by reviewing this decision tree. So you should document it. There may be a point at which you need to train on it. New product launch. Again, a really great opportunity for documentation, right? You're going to need to document what the new product is, maybe what the features, advantages, and benefits are so that people can articulate them. You may need to document the FAQs from customers. You may need to document the competitive advantages. And these are all things your sales team can then use to just look at when they need, because there is no way they're going to remember all of the information about your new product on day one. Now, if this is a brand new product and you're expecting your sales team to go out and launch it, then they're going to need a little bit of training. And, I think you're seeing the theme here, right? If it's new, or if it's adding to a skill they already have with new information, then you're going to need to train. If it's just something that needs to exist somewhere as a reference, or if it's just something that someone can easily grasp by reading a few paragraphs, not pages and pages, like a few paragraphs, that's when you go and use documentation as a learning support. And then as a business support, you want to be documenting all of this information anyway, because that will be helpful for, again, creating those references and resources people can use later, or just, being able to make things trainable.
Someone's at the front door.
And that is the beauty of technology in 2023. Google lets me know when someone's at my house. So moving right along, we're going to go with, it's a skill that needs to be built. So we've said this a few times already. I know I'm saying the same things, but I really want you to hear it. If it's a skill that needs to be built and they don't have this skill currently, there needs to be training. This is probably the only one where I would say it's not documentation. Documentation is not going to solve your skill gap. Documentation can support people in developing those skills or refreshing skills, but to build new skills, it will always be training. Then it's an attitude that needs to be adjusted. Here's another fun one, and I'm going to say actually neither training nor documentation is likely to solve this problem, at least on its own. So if people are coming in with the wrong attitudes, or people are developing the wrong attitudes, then you're actually looking at a few things. It may be a motivation issue. And is that intrinsic? Like they just they don't have personal motivation? Is it extrinsic? Is the manager somehow demotivating them? Is money not quite right at the job? Are they being overwhelmed by the task? Do they not have what they need? Are they not seeing a connection between the work and the things they're being told? Those things are not going to necessarily be solved with a one-off piece of training or documentation. Now, that said, when you start to identify those gaps, maybe it is training in that maybe your managers need training to support their team being motivated. Maybe what you see is they don't understand the connection and you need to do a bit of storytelling, and you can do that through a quick email series or some kind of communication, right? So those aren't going to be moments when documentation is required, but when it's a good idea to really check in with your learners. So hopefully you've seen the trend here. Documentation, that's manuals, that's knowledge-based articles, that's references, checklists, other kinds of job aids. Those are great, and there are lots of moments to have them. And particularly if you have a skilled team that really just needs to be able to find the information they need when they need it and not so much to learn it and apply it, then go documentation. And when you're working on those new skills, when people need feedback, when they need safe places to practice before they put these higher stakes skills to test in higher stakes situations, then you really want to use training to do that. So I will shift over to the comments and start taking questions. And I see that there are a few of you out there, so please don't be shy. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have. And while I wait for those to come up, I'm just trying to queue them up on LinkedIn here. I can tell you some of the cases that I've seen personally happening in the field. One of the big ones is, I think I mentioned it at the very start, but this idea of giving people a document and asking if they understand. So I'm a big advocate for not using training where training isn't necessary, and that probably there's too much training in the world, even though, my company makes money when we develop it. But oftentimes what I'll see is that in lieu of developing that training, people will just take documents and throw them at new hires with no context. And so what I would say is, if you don't have the time to build a full training program right now, maybe like e-learning sounds great and you have a remote team so you would need it, but we don't have time to produce videos and all that. Do the simplest thing you can, which is take that document and at least split it up into different modules. Right, so just figure out what's the main goal I'm trying to accomplish for each of these pieces of this document. And if you start there and then add a call to action layer, so something like go talk to someone about X, right? Or take this skill and do Y, or let us know in the comments. Maybe you put it in like a Microsoft Team channel, right? Let us know in the discussion what you think about this thing. Or you give them a short little quiz just about this one section, not about the whole 70-page documentation. Then you can sort of game training. It's not going to be necessarily the best and most engaging training, but at least it will it will prevent that overwhelm that comes from just looking at pages of documentation and wondering what the heck you've looked at. I've experienced that myself when I was kind of getting onboarded or initiated into the world of aviation. I looked at the flight manual and it was terrifying, and the trend was kind of just like, well, that's how pilots learn. They just keep reading these manuals, and that's not really how pilots learn. Oh, this is a great question. So I'm going to pop this one up from Stephanie. You mentioned storytelling. What's the most effective way to include it in your course creation? So storytelling is a great tool for training, and whether it goes in your course or it's just part of your internal communication strategy, there are lots of ways you can storytell. So maybe what I can ask is, can someone give me an example of a training issue they're experiencing right now? And maybe we can come up with a story to tell to help further that training along. So maybe Stephanie, I'm going to put that homework on you, and then we'll come back to your question. And in the meantime, I'm going to go to Nicholas. How about when you want employees to take more ownership of their careers by filling out their employee development plan? Is that more of a mindset obstacle or something training can solve? That's a great question, Nicholas. And I'm going to say it's a few layers. First of all, many clients I work with, they're not actually listening, I have to say, to their employees. They're not doing employee engagement surveys, or they're not really using and reading that data. So the first question I would ask is, if your employees aren't taking ownership, have you actually listened to them and asked them what they need, want, and what is motivating or demotivating about the environment that they're working in? If you've got that information and it just sounds like they just want more opportunities, then the second layer I would say is your management staff prepared to support goal setting? And a lot of times just putting a performance development or employee development plan in front of somebody is not enough, because they don't know how to set meaningful goals. They might not know what industry benchmarks exist for them. They might not have done that soul searching. And so your managers need to become mentors and lead them through these conversations. So you may need management training to support that then employee development plan. And then the documentation may exist because you may need to structure, right, one single document that talks about this is our process, and one single document that talks about that is the template, right? So this is the actual employee development plan template. This is how we're going to walk people through it. Here you go. So I think it is a little bit of both. And then there are people who are just not into their jobs, and maybe, growing in their job is not the important thing. And so in that case, if you work when I was younger, I worked at Best Buy, and that was not going to be my future career. And I don't know that I saw a lot of connections to the things I would do later in life. And I found them later in life. But if you asked me, what are your goals at Best Buy, I would have kind of rolled my eyes. But maybe that manager could have sat me down and talked about just what are my goals in general, or what are my strengths and weaknesses. And so that could break down that mindset obstacle. But that is not necessarily a training issue. Again, that is mentorship and, really looking at the employee experience. Oh, and you're totally welcome. Yes, I think, a lot of times documentation, especially if your technical writers are doing it, are arranged in a way that makes it easy to get around, but not necessarily intentional, right? It's like a user manual or something like that. So if you just start to think about, well, why is it structured the way it's structured, and how can we take this apart into pieces, make it a module, it's a good start. And my goal, obviously, for my clients is not to just deconstruct it, but I also acknowledge that business moves fast, training can be expensive, not everything has the same priority and the same urgency, and so sometimes you just have to build what works in that moment in time, especially if it's not going to be around in a month or two. And so I'm going to go back to Stephanie's question about storytelling. Stephanie, I don't see that you've done the homework yet to give me an example, but we'll try to come up with one on the way down. So I think there's a lot of great ways to include storytelling in training, and one is getting buy-in from the learner. So creating a character or a story or a world that draws them in and helps them to see what's in it for me, and maybe does a little bit of work to just engage them. And sometimes it's fun, right? I personally love Pixar movies. I'm going to assume a lot of you do too. So sometimes it's really getting creative, but sometimes it's just telling a story about somebody's experience, or capturing a leader talking about their experience, something that maybe the average employee wouldn't have a touch point to on a regular basis. Those are great moments to sort of market the learning that's to come. And okay, so we're talking about a little bit different. So I don't do a lot of K-12 or K-5 work, but I've been in the space before. So for storytelling, I think there are a number of ways that you could use storytelling in the K-5 classroom. I'm a big advocate for having kids write stories about anything and everything, because stories kind of give you mental models for things. And so if they're writing about science, let them write a story about going to Mars and what they would need to bring and all of that. If they're doing math, have them write the problem and tell the story of the scenario that they're then going to solve with the Pythagorean theorem. I think maybe they learned that in 5th grade. Might be advanced, but if they are it's social emotional learning, so I'm going a little off base here, but social emotional learning, having them tell stories from different perspectives can be a really powerful moment. And I'm taking this from my writing instructor background, not necessarily from my corporate L&D background. But okay, so now I'm going to shift one more time. So we're going to teach teachers how to teach social and emotional learning and do professional development. So I think telling stories to teachers about how, I'm going to bring it back, how stories work to enhance the learning for their students can be really powerful. I think scenario-based learning, where you're writing stories, right, making up imaginary stories about situations, or even telling real stories about real teachers. Remember, Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul was like really popular when I was a kid, and we just had stories about people who had gone through things. That can be a really moving teaching moment. And so I can tell you, we've done that for physicians and other hospital staff experiencing burnout. We did like a little mini docu-series within a training where we just went through and we talked about how people knew they were experiencing burnout. And it was a really powerful learning moment. And it could have been a really crappy training, because training about burnout is like adding to your burnout, right? So I hope, okay, good. It sounds like I've answered that question a bit, Stephanie, and I know there's a lot there. Maybe we'll do a whole thing on storytelling next week, since admittedly I haven't put out the content yet. So we are over our 20 minutes, and I'm really grateful to all of you that joined me today. If you have further questions about this whole documentation versus training debate, feel free to drop them in the comments, and I'll check throughout the week. And as always, you can find me at Your Instructional Designer along with the rest of the team. And, you know, I think inspired by Stephanie, let's just call it now. We'll make next week's topic storytelling in training, and just talk about how you can use that. So I hope you'll join me next week if that's a topic of interest, and I'll be a little more descriptive and specific about some of those use cases. So thanks again. See you next week. Bye-bye.